the hotel that hid something terrifying, a strange encounter in Rochester, Minnesota. Good evening. Please remember that every like and comment helps YouTube distribute our movies for more people who appreciate weird pastas. If you are enjoying our work, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. This will help us meet our target of 3K subscribers by the end of January. The business I worked for opened a new office in Rochester, Minnesota, back in 2015. It was typical routine for me to stay there for approximately a week in order to review their hiring process and approve a few larger expenditures. Although I had previously completed this task at an affiliate branch, it was my first time working alone, and it came with a lot of responsibility. My work is interesting in and of itself, but what I'm here to tell you is about something that happened at that specific hotel. I got a room at a small hotel called the Silver Sand Hotel, which I believe closed in 2021 and can't see online anymore. It was just down the road from Silver Lake, hence the name, and didn't have many visitors, so the rooms were inexpensive and surprisingly fresh. I don't like make-believe and ghost stories because I'm a practical man, but I can't deny what I've seen and heard firsthand. After my first day at the new office, I was exhausted and had only eaten a cheap deli sandwich with salami and brie cheese, and my stomach was turning over. Before turning in for the night, I was smoking outside the hotel and conversing on the phone with my wife. I often pace back and forth during lengthy phone conversations. I was hardly paying attention when I stumbled over a little patch of thick grass beside the back road and noticed something blue. Upon closer inspection, I discovered a handful of blue sunflowers. At first, I assumed they were simply dead and dried, but it was only a color. I chose one to bring home to my wife because blue is her favorite color, and I think she heard something sly in my voice because I recall her making a comment about it. When I returned to my room, I found a Bible on the nightstand. I opened it to a random passage, placed the sunflower inside, and then placed a lamp on top of it for pressure. I didn't give it much thought until the following morning. When I woke up, I noticed a few small black bugs crawling across the nightstand, maybe 3 or 4, and crushed them with my thumb. I washed my hands and assumed that was it. After a long day at work, I went to the office, but I completely forgot about that small detail. I assumed that it was just something brought in with a flower, and that they would soon be dead or gone. Before long, my mind was filled with Excel spreadsheets, email responses, and company policy. I didn't have time to think about the little things that were crawling around my hotel room, but by the time I returned, I couldn't ignore them any longer. When I sat down on my bed and turned on the lamp, they were impossible to ignore. They had spread from a few to a few dozen, and they weren't just crawling around my nightstand. They were crawling all over the Bible and the dry-pressed sunflower in my bed. I threw the thing away. I tried to remove the bugs, but there were so many, and a few of them got on my clothes. They didn't bite or anything, but I could still feel their faint tickling me, and even after I had wiped them all off, I could still picture myself feeling them. It was late, but I was disgusted. I went downstairs and talked to the receptionist about my room having a kind of bed bug problem, and they took it pretty seriously. They gave me a new room immediately and told me they'd investigate it, but despite a shower and a change of clothes and a completely new room, I could still feel those things tickling my skin. I imagined seeing them only for it to turn out to be specks of dust or grains of sand. They were gone, but they didn't feel gone the next day as I left for work. The receptionist called me over. I was a bit stressed, and I think she picked up on that, so she cut straight to the point. "So we haven't found any bed bugs in your old room," she explained. "You should be okay. I'm sorry if you were inconvenienced. Are you sure there were no bed bugs?" I asked. "Did you check the nightstand?" "Yeah, we checked all over. We take this sort of thing very seriously." "Well, I'm sure what I saw," I said. "There were bugs there." "I don't know what to tell you, sir. There's nothing there." That distracted me a bit. I couldn't stop wondering what they had been and how they could have gone without a trace. It had just been a day. There ought to be a couple still around, but it didn't stop there. A couple of times that day I got these sudden. I was in a meeting with one of our local suppliers, and I would completely lose my train of thought in mid-sentence, like I'd had a mid-sneeze. I checked myself in the bathroom 3 times, and at one point, I took off all of my clothes in a bathroom stall and shook them piece by piece to see if anything fell out. When I got to my socks, a small black dot fell out, but I couldn't tell if it was a dead bug, a grain of sand, or just a speck of dust. I felt paranoid, so I checked the room up and down, but I couldn't find anything. I showered for about an hour, scrubbing myself all over with 2 types of soap, checking my hair, my beard, and my ears, and with each tiny black particle that fell out, I felt my heart sink. My senses were screaming at me that everything I touched was these little, ticklish things, and I was no longer able to distinguish between what was what. I had terrible nightmares that made it difficult to tell where my bed began and where the nightmare ended. I would wake up with my heart thumping, checking the bed repeatedly, and I would dream that I was covered in those things. Overall, I only got about 2 hours of sleep, and I was a complete mess the next day. I had to review the final version of our contract, which meant that the morning would be terrible. When I put on my clothes, I discovered a few bugs this time. Without a doubt, they had moved, and there were about a dozen of them crawling over my bag. The receptionist rolled her eyes but kept a smile on her face, clearly indicating that I was having some sort of hypochondriac moment or that I was playing with her. She was a stalwart professional, so she smiled, agreed, and wished me a good day. I stopped briefly at the reception because I was already late for work and explained that I had discovered a couple more bugs and that I would appreciate it if they checked it out and if they found something that they moved my belongings to another room. I must stress that I have no issue with creepy crawlies. I ate earthworms as a dare when I was a kid. I would catch bumblebees with my bare hands. I never really cared about that stuff, but something about these things really bothered me. It's as if they weren't just intrusive, they made me doubt they were real. That day went by in a bit of a blur. I have vague memories of almost falling asleep in a meeting and having a long discussion about something that I forgot the topic of halfway through. I kept getting these random tics where it felt like a nerve had been pinched. I tried to remind myself that it was almost likely my imagination, but then again, I couldn't tell for sure. By the time I got back to the hotel, I ran up to the reception. The receptionist that I had previously talked to had finished her shift, but the man who'd taken her place had clearly been told about me. He was ready. I didn't even ask him before I got an answer. "Sir, there are no bugs in your room," he said. "You're completely fine, and yes, we've checked and double-checked. I am sorry, stress you know, I'm sure I saw something, but sir, I understand it's fine. If there really were bed bugs, that would be something we take very seriously. I don't know why they are, but I saw a bunch of them crawling across the floor, really small things like ground pepper." He raised an eyebrow and gave me a courteous KNOD discussion over that night. I was exhausted. I just lay in bed letting whatever crawl around do it. I didn't care. I could feel them in my hair and on my skin, but they couldn't be real. They'd already checked and there were no insects in there, and yet I found myself looking at a dozen or so of them crawling around on the floor. As I dozed in and out of an uneasy sleep, I heard a strange scratching noise like someone dragging a brush across the carpet. Looking over the edge of the bed, the insects on the floor were gone. Or had they never been there to begin with? I kept hearing this strange noise all through the night. I finally fell asleep with my arm hanging over the side of the bed. I could feel a couple of the bugs gathering on my fingers. Then there was something cold, something like a wet dog nose. Something touched my finger. I drew my arm up and rolled over, praying it was only my imagination, as the first rays of the morning sun peeked through the hotel curtains and something quickly retreated beneath the bed. It was my last day, and I was checking out, so I checked my bag and my clothes one last time, and everything appeared to be in order. However, I couldn't imagine anything hiding under my bed in the morning, and I couldn't tell if it had been a dream or not because the bugs on the floor were gone. All I could find under the bed was a tiny vent that was barely large enough for someone's head to fit in. Nothing spooky or crawly. I gave the receptionist my key after checking out of my hotel, and she asked a few questions tonight. I answered, not more than usual, and she huffed, "But I don't understand. Did you actually see something up there?" "Sometimes, I admit, it's like these tiny black dots." "I don't know what to say, sir. I don't want to come across as accusatory, but I would like to offer some advice." Of course, she looked at me for a long time. Jordan vacuumed the place twice, maybe even 3 times, and he couldn't find a single bug. My eyes felt heavier and heavier the more I kept eye contact. I was more tired than I first thought. "It seemed maybe it's not the room, sir," she said. "Maybe it's you or something you brought, and I made it through the day without all that much trouble. We had a couple of meetings, rounded off a few difficult conversations, and double-checked the issues we'd tackled all over the week. Despite it all, I was done, and I could go back home, work over. It was already getting dark when I got to my car if I left. Immediately I'd be home by midnight. Would probably have stayed another night, but at that point, I just wanted to go home. I needed something familiar to reset. Usually when I feel like I got a loose screw, my wife is the one who keeps me grounded. I really miss her." It was all such a relief. I was associating that hotel with that itchy feeling of having something crawling on my skin, and getting as far away from it as possible really helped. It wouldn't matter if it was real or not if I was far away, so I drove off, adding some distance between me and the town of Rochester. But another 30 minutes or so down the road, I felt that itch, that tickle. I stopped at a rest stop up ahead, turned off my mic and closed my eyes. I took a few deep breaths. I tried to convince myself I wasn't really feeling it. It couldn't be there. It wasn't. It was really dark outside. I could hear cars and trucks passing by from the nearby road. There was no one else around, or at least so I thought. Looking back at it, there had been signs, the scratching noises at night, the air vent under the bed, and why I was the only one to see those bugs. I opened my eyes hoping that something had changed, but I couldn't tell because I hadn't noticed it. I turned my car keys, but nothing happened. I tried again, but there was no sound, so I got out to check the engine, but I couldn't figure it out. I'm not much of a car guy, but I could tell that a couple of cables had either been cut or pulled out, but it wasn't a clean cut, even though it looked like they hadn't been in my car. When I observed tiny black spots on my hand, which I could actually feel, I took out my phone to call for help. Then, with a click, my glove box gently opened by itself, and something pure white and glistening moist appeared like an extended slug. I couldn't move. It's as if I couldn't fully comprehend it. There was barely any light, just vague reflections coming from passing cars in a rhythmic pulse-like manner, like a slow strobe light. And with every new pulse of light, that thing was a little closer. I couldn't tell if it was trying to sneak up on me or if it was just naturally slow. It touched my arm. It was a familiar sensation. This is what I'd felt that night when I let my arm hang off the side of the bed. It twitched a little and gave my arm a big lick. The thing burned like acid, and it suddenly hit me that this was in fact real. My heart shot out of my chest as I stumbled my way out of the car, falling backwards out of the driver's seat. I kicked the door closed just as the white writhing mess drew itself at the window. It looked gelatinous. It pressed itself against the corner of the window and slowly forced its way through. Only then did I realize I'd left my phone in the car. I must have dropped it in the moment that thing touched me. I crawled backwards to get some distance, but by the time I'd gotten up to run, that thing had made its way out of the car. It was surprisingly big, tall enough to reach my midriff if it scratched. I can't explain properly what this thing looked like. It was more octopus than slug, but it had the texture of a soft chitin. It had a body-like mass which resembled a cluster of lotus pods. A few pods produced these long appendages which seemed to stretch several times its height. It's so hard to say what was up or down or the head. I couldn't see any eyes or ears, but it seemed to know exactly where I was, so when I turned to run, it was right behind me. It was faster than I'd anticipated. It threw out its arms and pulled itself forward, quickly gaining momentum until it could wrap itself around my leg. It did so with the force of a foxtrot. I made it to the tree line before it got me. There was a nearby picnic table, and I managed to grab the foot of it. I tried to pull myself forward, but that thing, it was heavy. It was like trying to drag a plastic bag full of marmalade. I fought it tooth and got a nail. I punched, kicked, slapped, and pulled at it, but it just kept climbing. Those appendages wrapped around my arms, burning me like acetone. It got to my neck, and I could hear a sound coming from it like an inflating and deflating balloon combined with a purr of a cat. Then it retracted a membrane, revealing a stinger. It struck me in the shoulder. I was full on panicking at this point, screaming for help at the top of my lungs, but I just couldn't make a lot of noise. It wrapped something around my arm and pressed it so hard that I thought something would snap. The more I pulled, the harder it grabbed, locking me to the ground, but it wasn't killing me or consuming my blood. This thing was heavy, and I was breathing so shallowly that I could feel my vision becoming blurry. I looked closer. There were little black bugs pouring out of the stinger in my shoulder. This blob thing was licking them up. These things had literally been inside me, and it was eating them. It explained so much. The bugs had been using me as a sort of carrier, and the moment I left the room, they disappeared. That's why I was the only one seeing them. They followed me, and this thing had been following me in turn, trying to catch a stray meal. This was like an anteater, and I was the until I tried to stay still. It dragged its appendages across my hair, effectively cleaning me like a worried mothered cat. I got 3 more stingers, one in my shoulder blade, one in my left triceps, and one in my right cowl. And with every wound it pressed, those things came out. Then it was done. It rolled off me and dragged itself into the woods. After a minute or so I couldn't hear it anymore. I got up and my whole body felt numb. That thing must have had some kind of anesthetic effect because I couldn't feel my skin. Around the punctured wounds I had these dark blue fist-sized bruises all over my body where that thing had squeezed me, but at that moment I was just happy to be alive. Getting back to my car, I realized something. That thing must have been more intelligent than I gave it credit for. It had understood that stopping my care would give it the time and space it needed to attack. It also knew how to stop my care. It had taken several careful steps not to be caught or seen before it revealed itself, and that first contact, it had slowly reached out to me as if to see if I was hostile. I picked up my phone and called for a tow. After all that, it seemed I was staying in Minnesota for another night. Now that I look back on it years later, I'm still unsure of how to interpret it. Something lurked within that damp flower, and this blob was feasting on it while this thing cleaned up the mess. I believe I came into contact with something I shouldn't have. I think there are ecosystems that live right under our noses, and some of these things come from places we can only begin to understand. If these kinds of things can exist up here on the surface level with us, what else is out there in the places where we can't look? It reminds me of all those dark and unchecked corners of the room, the world really, if you lift the wrong rock at the wrong time. I've never seen or heard anything like that before or since, but I can't deny that it happened. I finally went with my wife, but it was difficult to explain. I was just playing with a wasp nest, because it was easier than trying to explain what I had experienced during those days. I sound crazy just talking it out in my own head,